Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thanks to our brilliant panelists. We've got here Nadwa and Yousef, Mariam and Iona. Just before I start introducing everyone, just some brief information on how on what we will be discussing today, and just some house rules, just to inform those who would be joining us and listening to our discussion, that we are as keen to know your input as much as we are interested to hear from our members. So at the end of today's session, we're gonna leave some time for everyone to answer your questions. So please write down your questions, shoot them in the chat section, and then hopefully at the end of the session, we're gonna leave some time where our members and panelists are going to answer your questions. So welcome everyone. If I had I planned to meet all of you, it would have taken me years to do so, but I'm so glad that I managed to meet Nadwa, Yousef, Mariam, and Iona. And of course, we're going to thank Hadil, aka Abu Akif, for her great organizational style, skills, and helping us to form this great discussion. We're gonna keep it as friendly as possible, so it's more towards a chit chat, but with great input from our panelists. So just to remind everyone, we're gonna have some time at the end of the session. For those who just joined us, please just shoot your questions midway or even towards the end, and they will have time to answer all of your questions, hopefully. Let me first introduce our panelists, and we can start first by Nadwa. Nadwa Al-Dawsari is a researcher and conflict practitioner. Nadwa Al-Dawsari is a researcher and conflict practitioner with 20 years of field experience in Yemen. For those who are interested to read her research and her views and her great point of view and op-eds, please follow Nadwa on Twitter, as well as our other members. Yousef Assabahi is a great filmmaker. He is based in LA at the moment. He was in Yemen just some time ago, and making and creating brilliant ads that we were stunned to see lately. So Yousef is a Yemeni American writer and director. His first short film is a Patriot Act. He has a bunch of other short films under his belt, brilliant films that I'd advise all of you to check him out. Don't miss his Instagram account and follow him there as well. Of course, now we're gonna move towards Mariam. Mariam Al-Dhubhani is a Yemeni and Russian filmmaker. She's an award-winning journalist, filmmaker, and curator. She first pursued her passion for media during the 2011, during the Arab Spring, and then she co-founded her first media production. And then she didn't stop since then. She have directed and won multiple awards, and for short films that she has been working on for quite some time. I guess it's safe to say that there are some more work coming on their ways. So just keep an eye on Mariam. Lastly, Iona. I'm personally happy to see you here, Iona, along with the others. Iona is an Irish-British freelance journalist. She is a multi-award winning. Since 2010, her work has focused on Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. Iona lived in Sana'a from 2010 until 2015, and then she's been going and coming back between Yemen and multiple other countries, and she just came back a week ago. So without further ado, let's just go directly into our topic, which is reclaiming the narrative, framing of the Yemen conflict in the media, and basically how Yemenis have been portrayed and have been screened within the media and the screen industry. So first, I'll let our panelists start giving their input, giving each one of them 3 to 4 minutes. Each one of you have their own background and have your own input on it. So I'm so keen to hear from all of you. And let's start from Iona. Iona, you're muted.
Thanks, Hamza. Sorry for the meeting. And thank you for the Yemen Policy Center for arranging this. I think, we've all got a lot to say on this topic, and maybe I can put up a small defense for some journalists. But yeah, I think we're all well aware that the kind of reductive nature, both of media reporting, but also media consumption, is part of the problem. It's a very helpful article that you suggested we all read before this suggested. It goes back a long way, and I suppose when you're talking about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, you particularly think of the 1980s and the way the famine in Ethiopia was portrayed and how it was dealt with by sort of celebrities across the world, and the Live Aid and all of the reaction to that, and ultimately the reductive nature of it, but also the portrayal of Ethiopians then, and how much that kind of portrayal is still going on now, that we don't really appear to have learned a huge amount of lessons from all of that, and the dehumanization of people ultimately. I think, I'm a writer and not really a filmmaker, and the times that I have shot video for television, I found it really hard. It makes me feel very uncomfortable. I'm really not happy about the kind of diving in, shoving a camera in somebody's face and walking away, because I'm used to sitting down and talking to people for at least an hour when I do my written stuff. And I suppose what that comes down to is we're all well aware of what the problems are, and how, as an industry, journalism sort of feeds into the kind of victimization of Yemenis. And we're here because we know where we'd like to be and the kind of media reporting we'd like to see. And I suppose the question is, how do we get from point A to point B? And I'm not sure I know the solution to that, because I've had a lot of very personal battles, and I've learned to pick my battles with editors across the board. Of every time you're doing a piece of reporting, what are you going to really fight to keep in a piece of writing? And sometimes you lose those battles, and sometimes you fight really, really hard for them, and you have to pick the ones you're going to fight for, because you're not going to win them all, and sometimes it is about compromise. And even, when I started doing my reporting in Yemen, I never got to write more than 300 words on any, particular incident or event. Now I'm in the luxurious position of I never write less than 1,200 words. And even on my most recent reporting trip, I've come back and I'm supposed to be writing 2,500 words. I'm already told my editor it's not going to be less than 4,500. Now, when you're writing for old school print media, you can't do that. It's not the same thing as writing for online. It's got to physically fit in a newspaper. And equally so with social media and television reporting, you'll be lucky if you get more than 2 minutes for a Yemen news piece on a TV news report, and then everything gets reduced for social media. And I think that's not unique to Yemen, but I think what is unique to Yemen is the sort of long-standing lack of coverage, and a long-standing lack of knowledge about Yemen compared to particularly to the rest of the region. I mean, most journalists before the war that were looking to get to Yemen had either never been to Yemen, or the last time they were there was to go and do a piece to camera on the top of the Burj Salam when the underwear bomber became headline news in 2009, and they hadn't been back since. And so everything was reduced from before sort of 2015 to really counterterrorism, a little snapshot of the Arab Spring in 2011, and now we've gone to, you know, famine or humanitarian crisis without any kind of underlying context or real knowledge. And I think Yemen suffers from that particularly because there just weren't the amount of freelancers ever, or journalists, you know, staying in Yemen for any length of time, not like you've got in Beirut or even in Istanbul. I mean, Lebanon has the same problem, I suppose. But yeah, it's just a lack of long-term knowledge. And that's possibly one of the reasons why I stuck with Yemen, really, is because you build on that knowledge base, and then what? I'm going to chuck it all away and launch myself into something that I don't know anything about. And that's the nature of journalism a lot of the time, is dipping in and out of countries, and the lack of underlying knowledge. And I think also another thing which goes against Yemen as well, that I've noticed, is the Western media relies heavily on English speakers all the time, both for its understanding and in its reporting. And so, and as we know in Yemen, the percentage of English speakers is pretty minimal, and even more so now during the conflict. And so you again get information reduced down to a level that becomes a sort of a snapshot or a brief 10 seconds of subtitled quotes, and that's about it. I suppose the one thing I can say, or one of the few things I can say in defense of media that are all reporting on Yemen, is a couple of things, really. One of them is the access problem. So we've known throughout the conflict it's been really, really hard for Western journalists to get into Yemen. And what does that mean? They're often relying on humanitarian aid agencies, humanitarian organizations for images, for information, or even for access. To get to somewhere, they have to go with Yousef or with one of the aid agencies. And they're also asking them for footage, and, you know, a lot of the issues surrounding the imagery coming out of Yemen is related to the humanitarian crisis and is related to the aid agencies also using this kind of imagery. So it becomes one feeding off the other in that respect, no pun intended, of the media using footage from humanitarian and aid agencies because they can't or don't believe they can get other footage out, and also for access purposes. I mean, there's, you know, in every Yemen embassy in the Western world, there's a stack this high of visas of people trying to get into the country. So it's probably about needs driving that as much as anything else. And also then once you get in the country, trying to get a broader understanding if you are starting relatively from scratch. It's very hard when, if you're in the north, you have to have minders with you all the time. Even now in Marib, you have to be escorted, or they have to know where you are or what you're doing all the time. I mean, in my most recent trip, I had to have one location I was going to, I couldn't get there without somebody from the military being there. And they probably turned around and told somebody to shut up whilst they were trying to talk to me because they didn't like what they were saying. So, you know, there's a fear of talking to Western reporters, but there's also an aspect where Western reporters don't necessarily have the access or have the freedom to be able to go where they want to and talk to people that they need to. And again, this brings them back to the narrative that both sides want to perpetuate. So they are forced down that line a lot of the time when they don't necessarily have a choice, or the choice requires a lot more effort. And of course, we know there are, you know, millions of other stories around the world that that they're trying to cover at the same time, and any kind of barriers in the way or distractions, and they just won't even bother covering the conflict anyway. Some people might argue they'd be better off not covering it at all than covering it the way they have done. But those are some of the limitations that are placed on journalists that perhaps give them there's some caveats into what we see coming out of the country. But the simplification is really down to the way media has gone in that direction anyway, of everything being reduced and simplified. And you hang on to that, what is an increasingly complex situation in Yemen. I mean, I always used to be the first one to argue and say, it's not that complicated, but unfortunately it has become that complicated. And so trying to explain that complexity again, I've had to go into very, one-on-one battles with editors, saying what it is that I need to keep included in reports, and sometimes that can be very hard to do, particularly if you're at the lower level of your journalism career. You can't necessarily put up a fight with an editor like that, because you may not come back and commission you again if you're seeing as difficult. So yeah, I suppose that's my small bit of defense for journalists in that respect. But there is this complete double standard where we in the media would never portray people in Europe or America, anywhere west of the anyone living west of the Mediterranean would not be portrayed in the way that we see as perfectly acceptable in other parts of the world. And I think that's why we really have to look at the way we are reporting, because why is that double standard there? Why can't we give people the same coverage no matter where they are? This kind of, the old adage of othering, and that's ultimately what it is. Not giving any people any agency over the way stories are portrayed. And I think, I've learned, as you do, about that as I've gone on through journalism. And probably one of the things I'm most proudest of in the last several years is a piece by a very good friend of mine who's a doctor in Yemen, still is a doctor in Yemen. And he was helping people during the coronavirus last year. And I said to him, you've got to write a diary. I don't know what we can do with it, and I don't know what will happen at the end, but just do it. And he wrote it. And I found somewhere to get it published. And my goodness, he told his story, or the story of the COVID crisis in Yemen, far better than any journalist could do, or Western journalists could do, by selecting what they saw fit to go in a media report. So I think we also have to remember that Yemenis or other people are far more capable than we think they are of telling their own stories. They don't necessarily need us to tell their stories for them. And I think this whole kind of thing of giving a voice to the voiceless, people aren't voiceless. It's listening to the people who are unheard rather than giving a voice to the voiceless. So yeah, I think I suppose, but in conclusion, and I'll pass on, but is what is the solution? And I'm not sure I know what that is. And I'm open to hearing what other people's solutions are to all of these problems.
Thank you so much, Iona. At the beginning, it's just us unfolding the issue, and then hearing each one of you giving their inputs, and then we're going to ask some additional questions later on. So now we're just trying to unfold the issue, introduce it, things like what is the issue itself, because some people don't think it's an issue at all, just showing bodies and bones and saying that that's the reality. But yeah, so it's at the beginning, I'm really keen to hear each one of you telling us their input. So let me just jump right to Nadwa, our researcher. So Nadwa, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Hamza. Thank you, Hadil and Yemen Polling Center. It's really nice to be in the same room with the best and brightest of Yemen. So this is a topic that I'm very passionate about and have been talking about for a while. So what I want to say is that the Yemen conflict, not only the Yemen conflict, but also the Yemen peace narrative have been largely dominated by Western media and Western analysts since 2014. And it has been largely viewed from the lens of, or through the lens of Saudi intervention in Yemen, which is not how Yemenis see this conflict. Focused on the humanitarian impact, mainly of airstrikes, but in general, which is good, but it has been, the humanitarian narrative has been exploited and twisted and used and weaponized. So it also, and Iona mentioned some of this, it relegates Yemenis to either mere victims of the conflict or fighters who fight on behalf of actors. It largely ignores Yemenis' grievances. And in that sense, it's centered around power dynamics on the main actors of the conflict, So it's like Houthis, Hadi versus now, more like STC, maybe Tariq Saleh, but it doesn't really get beyond that. And as Iona mentioned, it lacks context. And Iona is one of very few who wrote some really good pieces about Yemen conflict. So I want to say that I appreciate her work. So I just want to mention a couple of misleading narratives about the conflict in Yemen that largely shape the perception about the Yemen conflict and largely influence how people see the solutions. There are so many misleading narratives, but these two are among the worst, I think. Number one is the war started in March 2015. And this was, this was mentioned by analysts, media, INGOs, UN humanitarian agencies. By insisting that the conflict started on March 2015, it basically dismissed all the atrocities that the Saleh and the Houthi forces have committed prior to that date, and the fact that that tens of thousands of Yemenis have, were displaced by that time. And many were killed and injured. The Western dominated narrative largely romanticized with the Houthis, especially in the first few years of the war, almost depicting them as ragtag freedom fighters, and depicting them as aggrieved religious minority, blaming their rise entirely on Saleh's oppression or Saudi-funded Salafis in Sada, ignoring that the Houthis allied with Saleh, who was their alleged oppressor, staged a coup and destroyed a political transition process, dragged the country into a civil war, and invited foreign intervention. And it also ignored the fact that the Houthis themselves are a radical religious group, no less than the Salafis. So the other also a narrative is that Houthis marched, this is my favorite, that they marched to Sana'a against government corruption, neglecting that Houthis chose violence as a means to take power, despite being part of a political process again, and despite ignoring that they are more corrupt than any other force that have ever gained power in Yemen. Other narratives also downplaying or dismissing altogether Houthis linked to Iran, and only after evidence piled up, you've heard Western analysts started saying, yeah, there is some link there. And this has had a profound impact on the conflict itself. The narrative has shaped how, it's not just people talking on media or policy papers. It did affect the conflict. It emboldened the Houthis and it fed into their disinformation, which they have used very effectively over the past 7 years. It allowed them to twist and hijack the humanitarian narrative and use it to strengthen their advocacy campaign in the West, and it did work. Not only it justified Houthis' violence, but it also helped them militarily, because the humanitarian discourse was used repeatedly to put pressure on the Saudi, effectively so, to put pressure on the Saudis and Yemeni government to de-escalate, and they de-escalated several times when the Houthis escalated, even when the Houthis escalated. And so it did allow the Houthis to make significant military gains, especially after the Stockholm Agreement. I see the Stockholm Agreement as, you know, the Stockholm Agreement is basically Western narrative in Yemen materializing, you know, as a tool that the Houthis used to gain militarily. So yeah, so you know, my problem with the narratives, and especially in the early years of the war, that Yemeni voices were always dismissed, shunned, called out, and even shamed. If they say something that's different, Yemenis were accused of being Saudi puppets, of being warmongers, and there was, you know, a pretty well-known Western diplomat who accused Yemenis of being warmongers and cynics because they had very serious misgivings about the Stockholm Agreement. And this is, you know, for somebody like that to accuse Yemenis is a pretty, you know, serious sign. Anyway, so I just, and I went through this very quickly, but I just want to say that I'm glad to see more Yemeni voices, you know, rising, talking, and writing. I think the narrative has started to shift a little bit, not sufficiently so, but it's largely due to young Yemenis like yourselves, and the few Western analysts who also, you know, kind of brought out these, help bring out these voices. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nadwa. Nadwa mainly focused on a couple of points that we will try and ask her further later on. But first, let's hear from Mariam, and then after Mariam, Yousef is going to provide us with his input as well. And then from there, we're going to ask some more questions, and then we will let the discussion drive you know, the session. But let's hear first from Mariam, and then later on there are a couple of things that just to give some heads up upon. First, we were discussing the article, and then we would like to cover as well the visual side of covering Yemenis and the conflict itself, and then we gonna tap a little bit regarding all the latest films, and that's why we have two filmmakers with us tonight. So Mariam, would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you, Hadil. Thank you, Yemen Policy Center. I echo the gratitude coming from Nadwa and Iona. The part that I would like to cover would be focusing more on visual representation of Yemen, Yemenis, the situation in Yemen, may it be in TV, in the news, in humanitarian campaigns on social media, in film. We've been reduced to a strap of news that just, you know, goes by quickly, that we are this X amount of deaths, X amount of disease, X amount of starvation. And we're reduced into these boxes that we are no good to climb out of. And in a way or another, it became attached to us. So Yemen, it's ABC, nothing more. If you show anything else, you're immediately dismissed as a Yemeni or a Yemeni storyteller in any way possible. As Nadwa said, we as Yemenis, if we say something, we're dismissed, as if we're constantly questioned. If we say something, it's not automatically believable just because we're from that country and we are Yemenis, so we do carry our own differences, our own narratives, but we're immediately shunned aside, as if we can't be having any integrity in our opinions, or we're not allowed to voice our own concerns, fears, and problems. This happened to me personally within a personal story that I made about something that I went through during the war. And an amazing, incredible American filmmaker who I really admire shut me down, telling me, where is the destruction? And I'm naive and I don't know what's happening. And that just struck me right there and then. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. I said, thank you so much, because I asked for feedback. But why is he allowed to say that? He's never been to Yemen? He doesn't know where that is on the map, but he's allowed to tell me that my feelings, my pain, and my story is incomplete or invalid just because it didn't match some sort of an idea that he has of Yemen. Sorry, I just got like a bit emotional. And I feel it's the same thing with Yemeni reporters or storytellers. Why not extend that education? In Yemen, we lack that education. We lack cinemas. We don't have institutions that teach us proper journalism, or how do we tell stories in a way that is not biased, or fact checking and all of that. These things, we gather it by learning ourselves, by scraps here and there. Internet helps a little bit. If any manage to leave and study abroad, then that's great. You attain that knowledge somewhere. But why not extend that knowledge and maybe work with a Yemeni reporter, with a Yemeni filmmaker, and see the way that people tell stories from that specific place? Because Yemen is diverse. We're not one person, one color, one shape, one look, one opinion, or one idea. We're just like anywhere else. We're 30 million people. Obviously, there are above 30 million stories. So why only shape us and color us in one color? And if we dare to disagree, or like, please, can I have a different opinion out there? You're immediately kind of shut down. And it really pains me that every time you're trying to grow out of that box, that disaster, another war in the Middle East box, and you're trying to bring a little bit of hope, if not for me, then for my little siblings who are still in Yemen, that they can aspire to something better, that immediately is shattered. Like, you're Yemenis, you're here, that's your place, know your place, shut up, we know better, we'll take over, whether it's in how we represent you, or how we will save you, or whatever it is. And it's really frustrating for younger generations to grow and not only see the war, nothing but the war, but then also not see a hope at the end of the tunnel, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Mariam. Yousef?
Thank you, Hamza. It's really good to finally, we've been wanting to speak for so long, and and we haven't done it, and yet now it's happening. Thank you, Nadwa. Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Iona. And thank you, Hadil, for organizing this. Before I go into what I want to say, I would like to add to Nadwa's point about the diplomat who said something like, "Oh, like Yemenis are you know," and I don't think that he was accusing us. I think this is what he believes. This is inherent in how the West sees, the Orient, how they see us. It didn't start in 1995. It didn't start with the color TV. It didn't start with black and white TV. It started years and years ago. And for a lot of, the Western, journalists or filmmakers, they're not bad. They just, it's an accumulation. A lot of times they don't even know that they are depicting the way they see us, not the way we actually are. And this is a very complex issue. I don't think we have the time to talk about how they see us and why they see us this way, and just the thousands of artistic work that has produced and emphasized this image of the camel riding man. But I will focus on how the humanitarian aid and NGOs that entered Yemen slowed down the growth of cinema, and how it affected it negatively. Obviously, in 2011, during the uprising, a lot of NGOs joined Yemen, and Hamza and I then were active in Sana'a, and a lot of funds that would be allocated to filmmaking would be, if Hamza remembers, oh, you have to tell a story about, like, I don't know, I mean, they would have these categories that make sure that the way you make your film has to tell the story about a miserable Yemeni family. It just has to be. whether it's about a woman who was married young, whether it's about a kid who ran. I mean, it has to do with the war, with soldiers, and for a generation that has no cinema schools, you know, this is literally their way of learning. This is what cinema becomes to mean to them. Cinema now is, or filmmaking is about, you know, making something that brings awareness. Well, I mean, which I don't agree with. Art is art. And so the generation of filmmakers that grew up in that phase, which might have been in their 20s, now understand cinema this way. When they go out and make a movie and you watch it, it seems like, you know, this is something that was made for an NGO, that was made for a conference, or for funds. The story is no longer important. It's how we manipulate feelings, and how I convince you that we are miserable. And I don't like to believe, and I mean, I don't believe that, oh, they are depicting these almost boneless, you know, human beings just to get funds. They don't do that when a white family is in danger. No, they go and they're like, oh, John is a father of 4 beautiful kids, and his wife Amanda is like, but why don't you say this about us? Why do I have to show my little brother coughing to death like in Hunger Ward? Or you have to show me 30 minutes of a disturbing scene of a little kid getting a needle? Why do I have to see that for you to give me funds? I mean, why do I have to show you that? So I wish there had been funds like back in 2011 that would have had more of an artistic focus, because there was a lot of money that was allocated then, and we just had, and now when you go to Yemen and you meet those filmmakers, they don't even take filmmaking seriously. You know why? Because there's a lot of money that NGOs bring them. And what do NGOs want? They want the same structure. And so not only do you slow the growth of cinema, you're corrupting our artists, you're corrupting our filmmakers, because it's easy money. They make good money, and there is just, you know, they just have to follow the formula, right? It's no longer a film. There's a formula. You have to show me a medium close-up of a woman crying about her son who never came back. You have to show me. So filmmaking is reduced to math, and to a formula that will make me cry and donate $20. There was another point, I forgot what it was. Maybe it will come back when we are discussing or having questions. But that was kind of what I wanted to shed light on.
Thank you, Yousef. So as we all heard, we've got Iona talking about giving us her input as a journalist, and I've got just a few questions, and then we'll jump from there to Nadwa, and then Mariam, and Yousef, and I'd like to ask Iona, because you mentioned how editors would dictate what will be published. And then I'm really keen and interested to ask you let me put it this way, and in a very plain language, what sells, unfortunately, and I'm saying unfortunately, what sells when it comes to Yemen amongst newspapers or journalism and international media in general. So yeah, please tell me what makes a story pops up when it comes to Yemen.
Well, thankfully, I'm in the privileged position now where I can pitch stuff to editors rather than them demanding off me. So that means I hold the power to some extent. So I can fight my battles from a slightly higher rung than I used to be able to. But mostly they're obviously interested in the airstrikes in particular, in the air war. Why? Because of the US support, the British support, and the international community support. They want to, to be seen to be holding governments to account, which is of course right, their own governments to account. And it means that, you know, their viewers have some stake in this, if you like. And I hear what Nadwa is saying. That's often at the expense of telling the other side of the story, particularly when it comes to the Houthis or the STC or other people involved in the conflict. And the trouble is, once you start going down the kind of route of trying to do that, is it gets more complicated. And as soon as things start to get remotely complicated, then editors tend to balk at that. And I mean, I've had to fight over, you know, describing the Houthis as Zaydis. When my editors will go, "What's that?" We just call them Shia. And I'm like, no, I've had literally a 2-hour battle of trying to include Zaydi in a sentence and not have it wiped out, you know. And these are the kind of, it just sounds senseless, but something as simple as that. And so, yeah, it's often about the air war and again about the humanitarian crisis. And again, a little bit going back to what Nadwa was saying, somehow we've already got this narrative that there is a famine in Yemen. Now, we can talk about the technicalities of how a famine is declared one thing and another, but the media was certainly calling it a famine back in 2016, probably, or 2017. And that's pushing the narrative a lot of the some of the humanitarian organizations, not all. But that then becomes the focus of what they want to film. And then when you try and explain, well, there are famine conditions in some places, but it's not across the country. No, that's too complicated. You know, we have a famine, we want to report on the famine, you know. And thankfully now I'm not forced into doing that kind of reporting, but I know plenty of people that are, and a lot of times do it because of the lack of knowledge that actually that isn't the case. It's more complicated than that. The context of the economic battles that are going on, which have resulted in a lot of this. And so, yeah, I can pretty safely say the two things that can help you get something commissioned more than anything else will be something to do with airstrikes or weapons that are coming from, I don't know, one of the Western countries and that are being misused in Yemen, which I do think is important, and also on the humanitarian crisis. And that comes down to showing pictures of emaciated, usually children, put in, you know, you might have a sort of 2.5-minute package and maybe 10 seconds of that will be, or 20 seconds maximum will be context on the situation of why there is, you know, starvation going on. So yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. And I think, you know, like I said, I'm in a privileged situation now where I am able to do broader stories. But even then, you know, I've had fights, even covering the kind of previously the counterterrorism stuff or the American covert actions, in trying to get into the details of the tribal context. And I've lost those battles nearly every time. And even one editor came back to me a year later and she said, by the way, I still think about those 2 paragraphs I made you cut out of your piece about the tribal stuff, because it was fascinating. It was really interesting, but it was just so complicated. And so yeah, I mean, it can be really frustrating. And also when you have that kind of stuff taken out, you know how important it is for people actually understanding what you're writing about. And like I say, I'm still scratching my head sometimes, other than, you know, people taking a sort of doing a lot of self-evaluating as journalists themselves and saying, right, this is the battle I'm going to pick, and I'm really going to fight to keep this in, whatever comes out at the end. There has to be a broader solution, and like I say, I don't have I don't have that. I wish I did.
Thank you, Iona. And it's really interesting to hear that input from you. And then, so if it's just too complicated for them, then the story itself is not interested. So it's just the topic. It's maybe it's the international language that have been built throughout the decades of just having poor people. So that's something that everyone could understand. rather than, telling me what is Zaydism or what is Shafi'i, and what are the complex of the tribal community of in Yemen. So thank you so much, Iona. Nadwa, would love to hear from you, and could you please elaborate on what Iona have already started in regards of simplifying the narrative to something that everyone could just sense on that thing. That's it's just what would be understandable by any person in the world. Okay, there is a conflict, so what is the destruction? There is a war in that country. What are the dead people, unfortunately? And when I say that country, I'm referring to our countries, because we all know how the coverage is being used in other countries. I myself am based in Australia, and when I see how things are being, how the media covers things, let's say when it came during the Christchurch massacre, which was an atrocity, but how the media covered it was different compared to how they covered other incidents, and then we could see other examples in different countries. I mean, they wouldn't even mention a name, or they wouldn't even portray a face, let alone showing just bones.
I think we lost you. Yeah, sorry, we lost you for a second, Hamza. We lost you for a
No, I was just mumbling on how unfair is the media. So please, yeah.
Well, let me put it this way. Yemen is irrelevant when it comes to Yemen coverage. Let me just put it that way. As Iona mentioned, so the focus is on airstrikes and the focus is on weapons sale, not because it's how it affects Yemenis, but because they want to bring their countries to hold the countries accountable for supporting the Saudis. So the focus has been mainly on that, how the US and Britain and other Western countries have helped exacerbate a humanitarian, disaster. And so that is the angle where the media, especially the media, I mean, I think media is much worse than even policy, the policy industry. So with that, Yemenis are the victims of this starvation, of this humanitarian disaster. They're the victims of the Saudis, who are, US allies, who are Britain's allies, which is, I think it's great to focus on Saudis' atrocities in Yemen and how their intervention has made the conflict worse. But at the same time, I think it's unforgivable to neglect the other very important, if not more important aspect, which is the fact that the Houthis have triggered all of this from the start. I mean, it was the Houthis that triggered Saudi's intervention. I think many people remember that, before the Saudis intervened, the Houthis were doing a drill at the border with heavy weapons. So that's invitation for an intervention. But so, and I think Western coverage of Yemen focused on two things over the past, I would say, 20-something years, on counterterrorism, and Iona wrote some really excellent reporting on that aspect, on counterterrorism and also on the Saudi intervention. And I think both of these things are not really how Yemenis see the conflict. They're not the priorities, at least not in the way they're depicted in Western media. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadwa. I'd like to because now we've got Mariam and Yousef, and it seems that it's been already 15 minutes. I can't believe that. I thought we were just starting, but I hope you all would allow us to extend our discussion a bit further. Iona mentioned something that's really interesting when it came to being privileged or reaching to a point where you can impose what you'd like to cover. So it's basically, we either need people to do, to follow that narrative of the editors of simplifying the language, and then us just waiting for a couple of years until one of them would be as good as Iona to impose what they really want, and then we'd be having because something happened just lately, and Mariam illustrated it on her social media, and I'd like to mention that, but it's slightly connected in terms of what the media is interested, or what the screen industry, whether that's an editor or whether that's that was a producer, in imposing things, and then ending up of if we were lucky, we're gonna have someone good to cover it out of 15, 10 professionals. Otherwise we'll just have to just handle and deal with what we have and just accept what we have to see. And this brings me to the point where to the point of having lately a film that was nominated for an Oscar, and it covered Yemen, and that's why we would like to hear from Mariam regarding that. That film was called The Hunger Words. Yousef tapped a bit on it, but I'm really keen to hear more from both of them. So just a brief info about it. It was a film that was done in Yemen. It covered only two parts of Yemen, Hodeidah and Aden. It followed the narrative of weapons or airstrikes, and then for many Yemenis, they've followed it, and they were interested to see like how this film is gonna be portraying Yemenis, because it's like, okay, finally we've got this producer who has this, we've got this director who just managed to get into Yemen, and then that's our chance to tell more stories, to show more, or to show the bigger picture. But then it ended up having something similar to another CNN report or visuals from a charity organization trying to fundraise money. So Mariam, tell
You cut out Hamza. Is it just me? Hamza, you froze.
Yeah, he froze.
Yousef,
But maybe you can.
Nadwa?
Yeah, Hamza, you froze. Now we can hear you. What was
Okay,
the
I was just saying that could you tell us about your experience of interacting with that director of that important film that was nominated for an Oscar, which covered Yemen?
Yeah, so this film, I didn't have any intention of watching it, to be honest, because in a way or another, I kind of knew.
Tell us the name of the film.
It's a Hunger word, and I don't know if it was ever properly translated to Arabic. It was called Warid al-Gua. That makes no sense. In addition to some parts that were left out, mistranslated in the film itself, it felt like a sloppy production that ended up going to the Oscars somehow. So the film had two parallel things happening: the film itself and then the campaign surrounding the film. And the campaign was accompanied, or still accompanied, I don't know if he's still active on it or not. There is a website that collects donations and has snippets and interviews from the kids that were featured in the Hunger Word film. Essentially, it's about starvation and kids dying on camera. And the interviews and the snippets are completely different than what the actual film is. In the interviews, you get a sense that, okay, this film is gonna change everything in Yemen. You're meeting those kids, you're hearing their voices, you're learning about where they're from. It's a whole different world. And then when you go to watch the film, it's a talk of misery sandwiched between three kids dying throughout the film. You start with a kid dying, in the middle, kid dying with the airstrike that happened in Sana'a, people screaming and death all around, and then ending up with a third child dying on camera. It was extremely disturbing to watch. I ended up leaving the last 20 minutes, it's a 40-minute film. 20 to 15 minutes at the end, I had to go to the other room and just close the door. I was watching it with my husband. He finished watching it alone. It was extremely disturbing. It made me feel that these kids are things, like they're soulless, and the camera, with the beauty of the cinematography, you as an audience feel like you're kind of feeding off their death and off their souls leaving their bodies. It's extremely disturbing, and I don't think any country in the world, any country in the whole world would be okay with this being shown. But for some reason, because it's in Yemen, we're supposed to be thankful and happy and praising him. Thank you for bringing this to the Oscars. I wanted to have a discussion in one of the panels. There were so many panels, so I signed up for one. It was with a famous actor. And I tried to get my questions through, but I was blocked with the PR team. And when I took it out to my social media, the PR person who was working with them started bashing me and telling me, be thankful for what those white men are trying to do for your country. It was extremely disturbing. No apology was made. Those comments were later deleted, and complete avoidance of even contacting me or talking to me. Keep in mind that the producer contacted me before to be one of the ambassadors that would sell the film out and share it, like as an influencer, and be asking and inviting the community to watch it and support it, without actually giving me the film to watch it. I didn't even have access to watch it through them, but I declined, saying that this is not a narrative I follow. Thank you so much. Good luck to you. But I didn't know what the film was about. After this incident, even the producer did not contact me, did not apologize, although I wrote him directly, asking him, like, what is this? I'm a fellow filmmaker. I would like to know, why did this fellow filmmaker choose this path, only shedding light on atrocities made by one party, as Nadwa explained, the rockets, the Saudis, and then equating Houthis with France for some reason. At the very last, is they're the cause of this conflict. Not shedding light that famine was there far before the war started, because it's gonna kind of affect the cause that he's trying to pursue and the image that he's painting. The film is a trilogy out of two other films, one in Syria and one somewhere with refugees in Africa. And it's this, I'm gonna save them, I'm gonna change it, but will you really? Because you're spreading false information in every meeting, in every interview about what's really going on in Yemen. All what you're focusing on is how you slept on the street. Who are you? Like, I thank you so much for taking the time to come all the way to Yemen and do this, but why really? Why really, if you're not aware enough and you're not acknowledging that you don't know what's happening in Yemen, but instead just sharing your theory of whatever you think it is, just so you show that you know or you care. That really disrupted me. I don't know his real intentions. I don't know him, but all I know is the film, and I judged it based on the film and then based on the PR that was surrounding the film up to the Oscars, but they didn't win. So I don't know now. I don't hear much about it.
Thank you, Mariam. Yousef, we'll jump right into you, and then once you finish your input, then we're gonna have been receiving lots of really interesting questions from our lovely audience. So Yousef, tell me first, you've mentioned briefly on how funds dictate the scope of art. So feel free to elaborate on that, or what I'd like to really hear from you as well is that how would you take, let's say if you just finished shooting some of your films, but let's say you'd be going back in let's say a month time, and we'd be sure, let's say in your next project, how would you cover something related to Yemen differently? What would how would you make sure that your scope of work is not going to fall in the same trap that other non-experienced filmmakers have done before? So please, yeah, tell me more about that. How would you cover a similar topic differently?
Well, I'm more privileged in the sense that, you know, I live in the States and I can work here and make, you know, save up some money and then go back and make my own stuff. I cannot count on funds or grants allocated, you know, for Yemeni filmmakers or even filmmakers. Movies that, I mean, grants that are allocated for that region, they are very limited in scope, and they have so many requirements and categorizations that I don't usually agree with, or I don't even think that the stories that I want to tell are of interest to financiers. So I just finance my own films at the moment, hoping that in the future this will be translated into you know, getting not funding from NGOs, but mostly from producers and actually, you know, someone who's interested in the film as a film, not as a way of, or I mean, just like, I mean, I think Iona was saying, weaponizing the medium of you know, whatever, like if that's TV or film or you know, any visual medium. And I think, but again, I don't have the right to lecture Yemeni filmmakers on how to do things, because they have a lot of responsibilities. I was talking earlier about, you know, the fact that NGOs pay so much money for filmmakers who shoot their documentaries, and they do. This is true. And yes, I would say, oh yeah, you can save up some of that money and then make your own films, but and then those people have families and they have to afford, you know, a lot of things. So I mean, and by the way, not to mention how complicated and how hard it is to make a film in Yemen, especially on Houthi controlled. I mean, I shot my film in Ib, and it's a short film, and it took me 4 months to finish it because I I was shut down twice. You know, having had permits and have done everything by the book, and you can still, you know, be shut down for no reason. So I don't really know what would be the best way. I mean, there are a lot of grants out there, yes. People can go ahead and submit, but it's just I wouldn't have the liberty to make the things that I want to make if I want to submit to grants. I think the ones allocated to Yemen. So I would rather just finance my own work at the moment. And also, like, there is a thriving commercial market in Yemen at the moment. A lot of companies are starting to realize that, oh, we can actually make, you know, we can actually use that as a marketing tool. I know this is late, way overdue, but this might be a great outlet to start. You know, you can start. This is what I'm doing. I'm working in commercials. You can make money to finance your own project. Then, and also in commercials, you have a lot of liberty to make things that are truly Yemeni, because the client doesn't really care as long as you make something that would, you know, support their product. They don't really care. But when it comes to an NGO, you know, the agenda are much more complicated.
Thank you, Yousef. Yeah, if that's the case, then the question would still remain: how, like, I've got an issue, I've got a war, I've got a conflict that we have, but how should that be covered? Or let's say, okay, we've got the humanitarian organizations working, and how, and they've got their own agenda, of course, like they've got their own projects, and they like cover them. And what really, I think, not just Yousef or me or Mariam or anyone else, I mean, I think it's a collective thought of, as Iona said earlier, like, we don't really have a clear answer, like how this thing should be covered, instead of, portraying their work. Like, we've seen a couple of examples from some organizations showing the impact, some other organizations focusing more towards stories rather than just numbers, which I think are great examples of how, you could slightly shift that focus from, rather than just mere bodies and bones or numbers and statistics, towards stories of impact. No, go ahead, Yousef.
I completely agree. And I think that's what I was trying to say, but without me saying, hey guys, we should finance our own films. I just wasn't trying to say that, because I don't have the right to tell people to, hey, save up money. I have the privilege to do that. Maybe we do, people who are speaking here, but I don't think a lot of filmmakers in Yemen do. For them, I mean, it's just literally, enough to get by. But yes, this is the answer. The answer, it has to be a collective effort. Unless something is made and it's shown to the public and the public like it, and then all of these agenda will start to shift. As long as there's no example, it's just not gonna happen. And I mean, this gets me. Someone asked, I think a Salafi, she asked an interesting question in the chat about why do the West, or why do the media outlets empathize less, or are less empathetic with us than they are, with the Lebanese, for example, or with the Syrians, and that's because, Yemen has always been in the backyard of the Arab world. We've always been just, those, like when you have your older brother, and you're like, I mean, he's just like a loser older brother, but you have to be nice to him. You are the origins of the Arabs, but that's all you get. They're just being nice to you. They're just being empathetic. Oh, sympathetic is the word. Unless we start working, I mean, Lebanon, because Lebanon is Fairuz, Syria, they have had a big presence in the media. They've long had. So it's a collective effort. It's our responsibility. We have to keep making that content. We have to educate ourselves. We have to tell our stories. We ourselves should convince ourselves that not all our stories should be about misery. Not all stories have to be about child marriage. Not all stories have to be about hunger. Our lives are much more complex. I've been trying to do that. I've been trying to just, switch the narrative from these sad stories. And I'm not saying they don't have to be told. They do have to be told, but there just have to be some balance, because at this point there's a disproportionate coverage. I hear less about just normal families going on their day, and I hear a lot more about just misery. And I mean, when you go to Yemen, it's life. Yes, there's a war, but people are living, people are marrying, people are having kids, people are going to school. So we really have to start telling these stories. You have to go down to the streets and cover something that people in the rest of the world can relate to. Because sympathy doesn't necessarily mean that they relate that they relate to you, but I mean, empathy and sensibility does. So it is our effort. I mean, I think it's our responsibility.
It is indeed our responsibility, and it's and I think let's not forget that things, when they're being filmed, are filmed by Yemenis in many cases. When photographs are being shot, they're being shot by Yemeni photographers in many occasions, not all, but many occasions. Iona would like to say something, so go ahead, Iona.
Yeah, just picking up on what Yousef said and what was said before that, really, and perhaps an answer to my own question about what is the solution. And I think maybe, as kind of representative of the Western media here, I can say perhaps we should learn something from covering COVID-19 over the last year and a half at home, and how we've done that, and how those stories are much more rounded. They are about families, they are about communities. They're not just filming, I don't know, cemeteries and, you know, individuals dying in hospital. And even when they are individuals in hospital, remember, we often, certainly in the media in the UK, blurred out the images of people's faces. You know, this is about dignity, really. And I think if the last year and a half has taught us perhaps anything about covering a kind of crisis in that respect, that involves, you know, a lot of death and misery, let's face it, that if we can do it at home like that, with some dignity given to people, and where they are rounded stories, and they are, like Yousef says, about how communities are dealing with things. It's not all about people dying, it's how people are living day to day. If we can do that at home, then why can't we do that in somewhere like Yemen? Why do we have to make it all about, you know, people, you know, looking distressed and starving on film, and remove them entirely from the context of how they're living and where they're living? And so, yeah, maybe that answers my own question, but I just came to me whilst Yousef were talking, really, that we could learn a lot from having covered COVID pandemic, not just around the world, but at home as well, that we could offer the same dignity and agency, really, to communities in Yemen as we do to ourselves.
And in some occasions, there are times where the local parties do control what is being covered, and they do have their input or their ways of they do benefit of having that particular coverage, if that is gonna serve them and serve their you know, agenda. I've got here a couple of questions. I'm glad that some of them have been covered. So thank you so much, Sosan, Rifai. I've got another question over here from the audience. Thank you so much, Muhammad Al-Basha, and thanks for Nadwa for addressing the answer. I'll let you guys tell me if I should read them out loud, but for now, let me read this latest question. This question could be answered by any of you, which is, can social media offer opportunities that balance the dominant view of the conflict? Who would like to go and answer that?
I mean, absolutely, they do. I think we as Yemenis miss the point. I mean, we're not on Twitter as much. We're more on Facebook, and it's like we just talk to ourselves. Everyone just write a post, and then everyone who reads it is just the Yemeni. Like, we're just literally in the same room shouting and yelling, but I mean, literally nobody's hearing us. But yeah, I mean, look at what the Kurd brothers are doing in Sheikh Jarrah. They're doing a phenomenal job. Just two brothers, I mean, a sister and a brother doing just an amazing job. I think it's possible, but I can't romanticize that idea of like, oh, resistance and coverage, and I mean, I don't want to undermine, you know, or like what I mean, we all know what Israel is and does, but like the Houthis are also, I mean, to me, they are equally, you know, frightening. So you can't just go out in any area, even in Aden, you know, which is controlled by the government or the you know, you can't have that much. It's too risky. It's too risky for you to tell what you want to tell. I was telling the film I shot is literally a story about a kid, you know, wandering around the city trying to buy bread. There's literally and there was so much scrutiny on the script. They had to read the script and reread it and shut us down twice and show up to the set every single day, spying and knowing what we do, even though it's literally a silly. I'm telling you, it's a silly story. And so you can imagine if there was just like a more nuanced story that might have any messages. I mean, yes, it's our collective effort, but we really have to be cautious on how we try to say that, because I'm not a revolutionary. I'm more, I think your safety is much more important than anything else.
I would like to add on what Yousef was saying. I think you don't need a hashtag or a specific campaign. It's already happening. You have amazing Yemeni photographers in Taiz, in Marib, in Aden, in Sana'a, showing day-to-day life, showing some sort of normalcy within the backdrop of war. And that's exactly what we need. Telling stories through imagery with dignity, with the person, allowing them to take that photo within his or her job, his or her own environment. And these little things, these little acts of resilience, let's say, that doesn't really need you to raise your fist and be like, I'm going to start a revolution. But that in itself is kind of a revolution against death, against war, basically. Like, we are here, we will live, we will survive this. And I want to just add also another point on what is our role and what can we do as Yemeni filmmakers. Yes, Yousef and I were fortunate enough to have an opportunity to live abroad. But for Yemenis inside Yemen, I've been fortunate enough to mentor and train a number of Yemeni filmmakers, especially in documentary, because that's kind of what I'm specialized more in, and I can give them whatever I have of little experience, and then we build on it together as a Lego. So like, we're trying to start something from scratch, and together we tell stories of Yemenis, us Yemenis, with dignity. With what we think is best, with the person, not on them. And that's extremely important, I feel, in telling stories, not just in documentary, but in anything. And that is something that is lacking within the education and the ethics of how we tell stories with people. And I hope that this is kind of seeds to start some change. There has been a shift in also giving grants to Yemenis to tell stories. Yes, there is still this focus on, this needs to be focused on coexistence, this needs to be focused on, let's say, heritage. But within that, we can always manipulate and play with things. So you can tell a story of whatever you want, however you want, in this specific way, in this specific color, in this specific methodology that us Yemenis from each area have. For example, Yousef have his own way of telling stories from the area that he comes from, with their dialect, with the way that they dress, with the way that they eat, and each person from each area has that as well. So as giving those tools, these cameras or whatever it is, this little amount of money to be able to tell that story is in a way giving a brush to an artist instead of giving a gun to a kid. That is like kind of the dominance now, and shoving them into the front lines, saying that there is no way to live except the front lines, but instead pulling people out, pulling youth out, and telling them there is another way of kind of participating, but ending this conflict into something more beautiful, hopefully.
Mariam, I've got here a question directed to you and to Yousef. First there, it's from Rafiqa Rajab. She's thanking both of you, and she'd like to ask you if you are planning, you and Yousef are planning to make any films related to like any historical or mythical or drama films that you guys are thinking of making, maybe soon or in the near future. And then she's asking as well, is it difficult to find the right actors in Yemen, given the situation?
I want to thank Rafiqa. She's a really kind and dear friend. I'll leave the fiction more to Yousef. My fiction work is a bit like later on. I'm still working on script, and it's a long process and project. But I think for me, it's again the struggle of finding funds. I'm still stuck within 2 films. One is completing, one is still in the middle. And as Yemenis abroad, we wouldn't dare to take anything that might come to Yemenis in Yemen for film funds. But when you're competing with everyone else in the world, and you have that little slash of MENA region, and then the MENA region, all of these amazing filmmakers from Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, with established cinemas, and then Yemenis trying to dig their way through to get few $2,000 to be able to do their work. So that is something we're still working on, and I'll leave the fiction part to Yousef and the actors.
Yeah, like I have mentioned, I just a couple of months ago, I just finished shooting a 30-minute film. It's drama, and it was shot in Old Ib City. So I had to work. Yes, finding actors is really complicated. But going in, I wasn't looking for professional actors because I already know. And I was interested in working with non-actors. So, and this is also my advice to emerging filmmakers or anyone who wants to make a film. Well, let's not start with complicated stories. Let's not start. We have to. If you want, let's just do it step by step. We can't start with complicated characters who have to sob in front of camera because that's really hard. Or they're undergoing complicated traumas, because that requires method acting. It requires training, and if you don't have that, you're just gonna have a bad performance. So I would go always with simple stories and non-actors. If you create a character of someone who works in a grocery store, you just have to walk around Ib and find someone who works in a grocery store and is willing to appear in front of camera. That's what I did. I had an actor who was 85 years old. This was the most complicated character that I had to cast, and I finally found someone who's 85 and can talk in front of a camera. So you really have to just wing it, and just walk around the streets. For casting, I spent a month just literally walking around Ib, looking for people. And there was, a joke that the people would make there, because every time they would ask me, what are you doing? I'm gonna be like, oh, today I'm looking for boys, or I'm looking for old. And they're like, without the context of what we know you're doing, you sound really creepy, because sometimes you're looking for old men and sometimes you're looking for boys, and sometimes like, what are you doing? You're like, no, I'm making film, I'm nothing suspicious. So there's literally no method in Yemen. So you really have to just follow your instinct, have your dad act, have your brothers act. We have to start somewhere. And I'm gonna say this, it's really not that, it's fun. Like I think if I just had a bit more like knowledge of what to expect on set, I think my film would have been more fun to shoot. It's just because I didn't really expect all the complications that happened on set. But it's doable. It's really doable. It's hard. It's not easy. It's exhausting, but it's doable. It's worth it. It's fun. I enjoyed it, and hey, I'm going back again to show another film, and that means that it's worth it.
Thank you, Yousef. I have a question over here from Marley. Maybe either Nadwa or Iona could answer it. The question says, what about the impact on the communities/individuals featured in journalism and UN/INGO communications? Who and how can we take this into account when telling their stories? I'm gonna send both of you the question. It's slightly long. There is a risk of re-traumatization when people are coerced or forced to tell their stories over and over. I'm left asking, where are they now? Who is checking on them, etc. when reading or watching stories? So who would like to answer this question from Nadwa or Iona?
I can go first, and then Iona can add if she wants to. I think this is a really good question, because stories are a very powerful way of conveying a message, and it's very important to be very careful when you report on a story about how that impacts the individuals who are featured in these stories. I mean, what they say could be used against them on the ground. I've seen coverage of, but this is local though, not international. But so, which is why some organizations have very strict rules on how featuring individuals in their, you know, in their feature individuals, basically. There has to be one agreement by these individuals. Some of the organizations want written agreement, but also it's the responsibility of the people who cover these stories to make sure that they do no harm. They don't end up putting these individuals at risk. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. But the other part also is, which I think is, I see it as very unethical. It's not related to, you know, putting people in danger, but INGOs in Yemen, UN agencies, but also other agencies featuring beneficiaries receiving their help. Okay, I find it extremely humiliating and unethical, because Yemenis and any other poor people for that matter, they're proud people. They don't want to be seen as getting help. But they need that help. So if that means that they need to pause to a picture and show that they're happy with the you know, I don't know, a bag of rice or whatever that they're getting from that organization, they'll do it because they don't have an option. They need that help. So I really resent INGOs and UN agencies objectifying poor Yemenis to market themselves as humanitarian organizations. We know that most of the funding, 90% of the funding at the end of the day goes to salaries, overhead, and, you know, for these organizations, not really to the beneficiaries. So at least show some respect and don't use them for your own purpose.
Yeah, a quick answer to that. It's hugely problematic, I think, particularly for journalists, and because, you know, we can go into conversation about informed consent, but often people can't give informed consent when they're not in full understanding of where that piece of media is going, how it's going to be used in one context, how many millions of people might be seeing it. So, I mean,
and it's conditioned. Conditioned, like
sorry, you were breaking up a bit there, Yousef. I don't know whether that was just for me.
I said in that client, I get the.
Sorry, you might have to say that again. But yeah, for me personally, often I make that decision. If, you know, sometimes people will say to me, yeah, you can use my name, you can, and you have, as a journalist, a far better understanding of the risks and exposure that person is going to have than they will. And so often I've made that decision for people, even though I've asked them and they said, yeah, that's fine. I know it's not fine. And so I take the decision for them, and I won't use their names, and I won't suggest where they've come from or where they live or their, you know, and all the rest of it, because they can't make an informed decision. As far as re-traumatizing people, yeah, I mean, that's another issue. I'll send you a link. There's a thing called the Dart Center that does offer advice and training and guidance to journalists about that. And it's something that I'm very aware of, particularly when you're interviewing children, because it's normally the parents that are giving consent, obviously, and the parents are always there, but I'm always acutely aware of re-traumatization. And I'm actually one of those journalists that is a complete pest, because I will constantly contact people to see if they're okay afterwards, like for months afterwards, to the point that some people will say, Iona, it's really kind for you to do this, but I will call you if there's a problem or if there's something that's not great. Because you know, even I suppose as a journalist, when you're going back home and you're rewriting that story and your experience, re-experiencing them telling you that story, you're reminded of it as well, and which reminds you of them, and then you contact them. And so, yeah, I'm probably guilty of overdoing that aspect of contacting people and checking on them afterwards, if anything. I mean, nobody's accused me of harassing them, but it might have got to that point sometimes. But yeah, things like the Dart Center, I think, is a great resource for journalists on that. Unfortunately, there's not enough self-awareness related to that issue, though.
Thank you so much, Iona. I forgot my microphone muted. So I've seen here a question from Abdullah Abu Ras, and I think it has been covered. He was asking about the role of talented Yemeni filmmakers, and I think Yousef and Mariam have brilliantly answered that. And then he asked about why there aren't youth-led advocacy campaigns working to share the real story in Yemen. So maybe I'll ask Mariam about that, and then we could consider this as almost in the last, the last input from our speakers, and then we may first hear Mariam, and then I'm going to conclude this session. It's been, believe it or not, it's been an hour and 30 minutes. But yeah, I didn't feel it. I hope I didn't bore my panelists nor the audience. So Mariam, please briefly answer Abdullah Abu Ras. He's asking why there aren't youth-led advocacy campaigns working to share the real story in Yemen. Tell us what is the real story first, and then why there aren't, or maybe there are, and we don't know about them. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if what he means the real story is the other narrative of humanization instead of otherizing. I think there is still a divide within Yemeni storytellers, and there is still lack of awareness of the harm that this sort of narrative brings. There are brilliant, amazing Yemeni storytellers that still support this, saying that this narrative is better than no narrative. And you can imagine how that would affect having a unified front into pushing for advocacy, because immediately you get attacked by a number of people saying, shut up, be grateful. It's better than having Yemen not mentioned at all. Something is better than nothing, not realizing that this something is breaking a lot. And the advocacy or the trying to raise awareness is not to bring down people who are trying to do even that. That should stay as an example of what not to do. But then there should be still a balanced representation of what is the real or the other side. So then people can decide for themselves, because cinema is not there to like hit you on the hand and tell you like, this is the way to be and that's it. But cinema is to provide different narratives. And then you as an audience, you're not passive. You are allowed to do your own research, your own understanding, and then see which speaks to you better and which you feel is kind of a kinder or a nicer representation. Before I let Yousef add something, there was a question about not being fair having a UN maybe representative to also have a say or a speak of how they go about their campaigns. One of the projects that I'm working on is actually commissioned by the UN Special Envoy's Office. And speaking to UN communication personnel, they are aware of that this is not okay. I made that clear in accepting this kind of work, and they also feel ashamed of going through that path for so long. So there should be a shift coming soon. I don't know if it's going to be all UN agencies, there are so many, but at least one part that is trying to do something to, I don't know, deliver an image of Yemen to policymakers abroad is acknowledging that this is wrong and we shouldn't go by that path. And maybe it starts with one film and then many others that will shift that perspective from using these images to beg for money basically in UN campaigns, instead having something more dignifying and more long-term helpful, hopefully.
I know I promised that we're gonna end it, but we just received just last two questions. Someone commented on what have been being mentioned, which was saying more Yemenis. Are you amplifying that effectiveness of other sides' advocacy was so because they were many? The person which came from an anonymous person say, my belief is that the way you do it is what matters. And I think it's not just about balancing things, it's also about even when you want to cover something, it's important to focus on how you do that. But I think we should wrap it up. Ammar Abdullah, provided a question, and maybe this could be worth elaborating on another panel where he asked about the role of national capital and Yemeni businessmen in financing and maybe investing in this industry. And I think this is a topic for another. Thank you so much, Nadwa, Mariam, Yousef, and Iona. It was lovely having all of you and hearing from you. I hope the audience enjoyed this discussion, and thank you so much again. Maybe and we'll catch up soon with another YPC panel and webinar. All right, thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Hamza. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Good night and good morning for those they're still in the morning.
Bye.
Bye.